Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on Mushroom Hour, we're blessed by the presence of Reggie, activist, mycologist, and founder of Oakland Hyphae. Reggie studied political science at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University and now has over a decade of political campaign experience, ranging from local and state level races to 3 presidential races to working with the New York State Democrats, the DCCC, and the DNC. On the West Coast, Reggie worked on a local level to replace police in schools with guidance counselors for the Black Organizing Project in Oakland. Inspired by early life transformative experiences with psilocybin-containing mushrooms, Reggie has had a lifelong passion for mycology and now consults with the largest mushroom cultivators in the world. He has worked with the largest cultivators in the Netherlands and is currently advising in the establishment of the largest commercial mushroom farm and state-of-the-art testing lab in Jamaica. He also has over 10 years of domestic experience in the U.S. cannabis industry, and Reggie is a member of the advisory board for Decriminalize Nature, as well as being an avid activist for police reform and an ally of the movement for Black Lives. Today, we're going to cover how he blends together all of his life experience through his work at Oakland Hyphae and learn about their first ever psilocybin cup. Reggie, thank you so much for joining us on the Mushroom Hour.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I'm a big fan of your work. I've been following your page for quite some time. And just thank you for reaching out and thanks for doing what you do.
That's an honor. I've also been a big fan of your work. You're right here in Oakland. You're a fellow Bay Area mycophile. So I've definitely been following your work, interviews, all of it. But of course, with every guest, and then especially with yourself, I'm curious, what led you into the world of fungi? How did you become obsessed with mycology?
To me, it's a funny story, but I've told it a few times and I'll tell it again. When I was in high school, I had a very limited experimental process in terms of drugs. I experimented with weed, and I really didn't do much alcohol in high school, and but I did experiment with mushrooms. And the way that I came across the mushrooms was an Eminem song. I think the name of the song was "I'm Sorry," where he says, "I never meant to give you mushrooms, girl. I never meant to bring you to my world." And after hearing that song, I'm like, "Oh, what the fuck are these mushrooms? What is he talking about?" And so I remember I looked and looked, and I found, believe it or not, I ended up stumbling across an international connection to mushrooms. At a very young age, I was getting high quality mushrooms straight from Europe. I very quickly discovered that this might be able to be a thing. So start on the base level there. There's nothing grand about it. I'm in high school. I have access to better mushrooms than most people in the country. And so, it became a thing. I eventually ended up going to Europe to work with the guys who I was getting the mushrooms from. I was between Switzerland and Holland. I ended up just working for what turned out to be the biggest cultivators in the world over there. This was before they changed the law in Europe to ban fruit bodies, and then later on the loophole to allow truffles. But this was actually pretty close to, I remember the first time I paid, the euro didn't exist in terms of a financial instrument. So I paid in check money. And then shortly thereafter, and I was loving that because the exchange rate was great with the dollar, But then the euro came along to kind of kick me in the teeth a little bit, but still it was a good deal. Moved over there, worked with those guys and learned a lot. But then the law changed and I came on home, and like that for a while, that was it. The law changed. These guys they all had too much money to risk doing anything underground. So that was it. I came home and pretty much kind of got into cannabis. I never considered myself a cannabis guy. It was just accessible. Like I smoked it, but the business of cannabis, I was never great at. I was great at meeting connections and I was great at, knowing other people. But for some reason, it was never my soul's calling. It was a point
Right
from point A to point B. And honestly, cannabis enabled me to work a lot of shitty jobs where I got a lot of decent exposure. So for instance, my main job, my tax-paying job, I worked with the Obama campaign 2 times, both presidential, but they were only paying $24,000 a year. Now, how you think that works out? You got to have something else on the side that's like keeping you afloat.
Right.
$24,000 a year I was a grown man. Like, so long story less long, I had a long relationship with cannabis. I never thought to jump into cultivation, really. I just knew that from my childhood experience that I had a deep reverence to mushrooms. Like for me, I never liked tripping balls. I still to this day, I don't like tripping balls. I have some of the best samples of mushrooms that one could have, and I haven't eaten any of them just because it's for me, it's when I need to make a heavy decision, when I need some guidance, that's when I dive into the mushroom. And so for me, I can tell you the last time I had mushrooms was September 19th. Well, last time I had a big dose was September 19th, 2019. That's how I remember the day. I remember the reason. So I secured mushrooms several times as I moved around, changed careers, and went through my journeys. And the mushrooms took me places. The main message that I always got when I like sat down and really focused on making this a spiritual ritual or something of reverence, I remember every single time it was like the ancestors, people from like I remember seeing pharaohs, and this is in my head. I sit and meditate.
Yeah.
I remember seeing pharaohs and pyramids like there, and I remember every time I go back into that realm, the first thing that I come across is a being or some energy that said, "Welcome back. The ancestors have been waiting on you." So that's the type of thing that mushrooms has been for me. But fast forward to the present time, I ended up moving from New York. I was working with the New York State Democrats and the DNC. I was doing some other political campaigns over there. I moved from there to Oakland to work for the Black Organizing Project in West Oakland. Our campaign was to push police out of schools and replace those police with counselors. What we would see is the school to prison pipeline was exacerbated by if you have a police that's trained to be a police with grown people, in schools with a gun, if they're trained to be a police and to arrest, they're not trained to help, these kids deal with the stuff. And so we saw a lot of kids being introduced to the legal system as a result of contact from school. Actually, honestly, the first time I ever went to jail, it was in high school. I stole a pack of Sour Patch Kids. I got arrested.
You went to jail?
Yeah, I went to jail for the first time out of high school for stealing a pack of Sour
For
Patch.
Sour Patch?
Yeah, I love Sour Patch. To this day, if I show you, I got a big box of gummies right now. I love them. I loved them then. And I remember I climbed the school store window was this big, and I climbed through and I climbed back out with I had 2 packs of Sour Patch Kids sticking out my pocket. And the gym teacher was standing right there to literally kind of pull me out and took me to the office. I got a 5-day suspension with a recommendation for expulsion, and they sent me to jail. I spent my first night there. I remember I missed my AP US history class because, or my AP US history test because of that. But anyway, I moved to Oakland and we do that work to push police out of schools and give more resource counselors. I did that for about a year. And then I left that and took one more swing at cannabis here in California. So I'm here, it's legal. I should, So I went and I ended up working with some farms out in Calaveras. I was involved to a light extent with the California Growers Association. Hezekiah and Kaz were both buddies of mine. But it just, I paid the $500 an hour for consultants to teach me how to get involved. And to me, it just didn't happen. So I took one last job with Color of Change. They're the largest online racial justice organization in the country. I was never a digital guy. I was always an on the ground guy. I worked Newark, New Jersey. I worked everywhere. And you put me in the street and I'm good there. They hired me to do something that they had never done before. They hired me to take their online supporters and make them in real life supporters and activate them to do things, activate them to organize their neighborhoods. And we were successful. I ran Nevada, I ran California, and I ran Texas. And we had big success here. We had biggest success in Nevada. To this day, Nevada's blue. We helped elect the governor. We helped put automatic voter registration. So whenever you turn 18, you don't have to worry about, you get a registration in the mail. A lot of good stuff. So when that contract ended, it was always a goal of mine to work for a super PAC. So I did that. And then I took a trip around the world. So when I took a trip around the world, I flew into Amsterdam, buy spores, buy liquid culture. And then, whatever happens to them. I go to Greece. And then I come back from Greece, go back to Amsterdam, buy some more. Whatever happens to it. Go to Morocco, come back, buy more. So at the end of this trip, I ended up with a bunch of liquid culture and Dutch genetics. when decriminalization passed here in Oakland, I want to say it was 2019.
Right.
June of either 2018 or 2019. At that point, the writing was on the wall. Like, I didn't even know why I was buying the spores or the liquid culture. I just knew that I was doing it. The mushroom kind of led me to do it. And I'm sitting, when legalization passed in Denver, I was like, oh, shit. And then I remember hearing rumors that it was going to happen in Oakland. And then I saw news reports. And then that shit happened. And I'm sitting with all these European genetics. And it was just, I took the last little bit of money I had and I set up a lab. From then on, it was just moving around community events, attending Decriminalize Nature. I became very involved with Decriminalize Nature. I worked with the Sacred Garden. Pretty much any organization here in the Bay, I've kind of, especially if they're in the East Bay, I've kind of touched on, or I'm on the periphery of, and I've found my way in working with. And so, again, I've been a community guy. I move around in real life, but mushrooms are also a part. And so I'm marrying kind of these two things.
I mean, this life story you laid out, incredibly vivid. And it kind of, all these life experiences, I always think of this mythological journey of Fatima. It's a story of how this woman keeps going to these different places and acquiring skills, and she doesn't even know why. And then she winds up in this place where all those skills are needed.
Yeah.
So you're this guy who has this, really what it sounds like, a sacred or almost a spiritual relationship with the mushroom. So that, I think that's important, distinguishing recreational use from someone who sees it a little more reverentially. You've also done a lot of political organizing on the ground. You've been part of a lot of basically racial justice movements, and all of those come together perfectly with decriminalization in Oakland. And that was the question that I was going to pull out of there was, how does the political work and the racial equality work tie in intimately with the modern psychedelics movement? Because I think that's one huge part of your work. And honestly, I mean, you and there are a lot of other people talking about this, but you're the one that kind of crystallized it in my mind how those things are intimately connected and how the psychedelic movement needs to basically bring in reference points or perspectives from racial justice movements and political movements.
So I'm going to do my best to answer that. And if I get off, bring me back. And I don't mean disrespect to anybody when I say this, but I think the political work marries more comfortably with the psychedelic world because it's more comfortable. Everybody wants the things to be accessible and legal, and that might look different to different folks, but everybody is in agreement that people need to have access to these things. In that sense, my background in politics is very helpful. What I left out of my story is I left working with the Democrats intentionally because I was in Staten Island when Eric Garner was choked. And I remember sitting on the phone call with the leader of the New York State Democrats. And I remember sitting on the call with the leader of the DNC. And I asked them very specifically, what do I have to go tell the community that our position is about this? And because three out of every 5 New York City police officers hails from Staten Island, and we were running a race in Staten Island, they didn't want to rock the boat. And so they said they're not taking a position. After that, I told myself I was no longer working for the Democrats. I finished my contract and I was out of it. And I was intentionally looking to have a say and have a position about racial issues, That brings me to answer your question here, where I think the mushroom community is ready to have that conversation. I think the mushroom community is open because for a long time, the mushroom community, there was nobody's face. It was just their work or the pictures that they took and an icon. But you would follow people, you wouldn't know who they were or what color. It truly was just, I like your work or I like the things that you like. The psychedelic community overall, I feel like is getting it wrong every single time. I think the psychedelic community is still into the tokenism. I think the psychedelic community is into having diversity the way that they want to have diversity. I think that the psychedelic community as a whole is into anointing various people as opposed to supporting the people. So, and again, this is no shade to anybody, but it is what it is. And I think it could be helpful if folks took a look at it. During Black History Month and International Women's Month, you saw a lot of people putting Black folks up front, a lot of people putting POCs up front, in ways that ultimately benefited the company or the organization, because the company or organization can then do the, what do they call it, value flecting or something like that, where you projecting you have good
virtue signaling.
Signaling. They virtue signal that they have good intentions, and it's for business. It's for the bottom line for the business. Now, when it comes time to support the community, it looks much different. It's largely absent. but beyond putting up a post, like the actual in the streets, putting rubber to road, it's largely absent.
I mean, I think that stands out for me is, and again, this is coming from a perspective of someone obviously who's kind of European heritage, also not intimately familiar with psychedelics. I wouldn't consider myself a psychedelic expert or really part of the psychedelic culture. I'm more interested in mushrooms as a whole, but obviously psychedelic mushrooms are a huge part of what that means for society here in the near future. So coming from that perspective, I see one of the big things as the benefit a lot of people see with mushrooms right now. And you could always critique the model of like pushing it into a medical framework. But this idea that it helps deal with mental and emotional trauma and issues. And to me, the BIPOC community, the Black community, the most appropriate definition there probably has the most of those issues to deal with. So it would feel like one of the biggest focuses should be on inclusion of communities that have the most to gain through some kind of spiritual or ritual work with psychedelics. And again, as an outsider, that's not something I necessarily see reflected all the time. Now, I know that's obviously changing. Decriminalize Nature is doing BIPOC only integration circles and things like that. But is that an accurate reflection? Is that changing? Or is that what support looks like?
So is San Francisco psychedelic community as well. Seth and so to your point, I think that to the mental health piece of what you're talking about, I can give you a personal anecdote. I had to take Ritalin all throughout school. And then to do all that political work, I continued to have to take either Ritalin or Adderall in order to like perform.
Yeah.
To the point where, I was basically an addict. Like I didn't want to take it, but in order for me to hit my marks, I had to take it. Then I got introduced to the lion's mane and the magic stammet stack. And I started taking that. And I take a lot less of those microdoses. I might need 2 or 3 of those microdoses a week, but I can make them myself. The medicine is more affordable. I don't have to go see some doctor just to write a script. And so for me, especially, I remember when the George Floyd stuff was happening, between the focus that the microdose gives me to be able to make the work happen, and the ability really to help me just process and let go a lot of the shit that generally makes me angry in the day.
Yeah.
I benefited greatly from mushroom, but I had to be a 36-year-old man to come across that. I think that there's, even right now, if you look in the news, we're bombarded with the George Floyd trial, these other people who were murdered, and then you hear people saying stupid shit, and you hold all that. And you haven't seen me post anything, not because I don't care about it, but because, quite frankly, the microdoses are just helping me process it in a different way. I don't have to scream from the rooftop. I know it's up. I know that these people aren't going to get justice, but me and a lot of people like me cope in times like this with the natural plant medicine.
Yeah.
So to your point, again, yes, I think that the overall psychedelic community, I think, still has a lot of work to do.
So there's individual trauma people have to deal with. And the example you laid out there is very vivid. People's reaction to living in a community where there's violence and murder and how you react to that. And then I've also heard several people, actually, William Padilla Brown was one of the people I heard talk about this. And I've had a guest, Antonio Raffel from Detroit, who talks about epigenetic trauma. And that is the trauma that passes intergenerationally. Now, epigenetics usually is kind of in the context of like physiological changes that get passed from generation to generation, like someone experiences a physical trauma, an accident or something that passes on like an actual genetic difference to the next offspring. But I found a lot of resonance with that idea. Well, yeah, but also cultural trauma of being like a colonized culture or a culture that's been subsumed by a dominant European culture, all that passes down intergenerationally too.
Yeah.
And are we looking at if these tools could be useful in processing that level of trauma that, again, we turn to psilocybin-containing mushrooms, as kind of this answer to, depression, all these individual traumatic events, because we lack a lot of answers. But epigenetic trauma, I don't think we have any answers. And this would seem to be a potential tool.
I think, yes, epigenetic trauma is a thing. I think that it's something that should be studied. I do think that this should be studied both in scientific fashion. I think that it's already being practiced in more smaller communities. I know a lot of folks doing healing circles and specific spaces for BIPOC, for women, for queer. to try to address a lot of the epigenetic stuff that you're talking about. Because I think that what it boils down to is really the ability of one person to fully heal.
Right.
I think that's how you address and stop and turn the dial on the epigenetic trauma. You hear people saying generational curses in my community. I think you kind of have to stop and break the generational curse. And that takes place with really the healing, not only the healing that plant medicine can bring, but the integration part as well.
I think that's a common theme, is breaking the pattern, healing it for yourself and kind of the past and future generations. So yeah, it ends up being work on an individual level. And obviously, when we're getting into these issues, I mean, I'm pulling from this kind of general framework of what racial equality looks like, the American landscape of kind of the overlap of cultures and the injustices kind of baked into the system. So this topic could explode into, multiple podcasts. I'm sure there are entire podcasts dedicated to it. But in your mind, for people interested in this piece, because I do want to get to the psilocybin cup and kind of the work you're doing there, who are some reference points or what are some useful resources to people listening to this who may be part of the BIPOC community and want to kind of see what that community building around psychedelics looks like? Who are some good reference points or inspirations in your mind?
I pretty much live, if I'm not in real life, I live on IG. And so some people that are readily accessible is some people, the Ancestor Project is really doing really, really, really good work. It's the Ancestor Project on IG. There's Niggas in Nature, spelled NEGUSINNATURE. They are a psychedelic friendly community based group. There's Spirit Works that's in East Oakland. Spirit spelled like a spear. Works, WERKS, I believe, but their Spirit Works on, and these are just some community based groups. Please forgive me if I didn't remember you, and that I know you. This is off the cuff, but
right.
These are a lot of folks who, especially the Ancestor Project, they are heavily based on just all around building community, specific queer, BIPOC community around properly using plant medicine for healing. I'm good friends with them. I actually have Charlotte and Dre speaking on a panel around integration for the cup.
Really powerful information. And one thing that I just thought of for you when you were talking about your visions of kind of seeing pharaohs and seeing past culture, do you also think, aside from just healing trauma, do you see psychedelics as a tool that can help communities, basically BIPOC communities whose cultures have been subsumed, colonized, destroyed, sometimes just kind of reference to something in the past and not having their living tradition embraced? Do you think this is something that helps people find and embrace their cultural identity and power as well?
I think the nature of what the mushroom has done, at least for me, is exactly that. With the mushroom, it is ancient technology. That's what Baba Kalindi calls it. And, it's I don't know. I truly feel like it takes me to a place where I can communicate with those ancestors that are with me and around me all the time. Anyway, not only does it help me be more clairvoyant and trying to make decisions around the future, but it also leads me to other places. It leads me to ask other questions that lead me to communities like mine. Like, for instance, I deal a lot with, his online is Darren LeBaron. It brought me to Kalindi, like asking these questions. I was asking the questions about Africans and their roots with mushrooms before I met Kalindi. That's how and I never met him, but before I discovered Kalindi, like when I'm asking these questions to people in the community, they're like, hey, check this guy's work out. He's talking about what you're asking about. And that connection brought me to more people. And so I don't know. I know I sound like one of these, people who carries crystals and burns sage all the time, but it's real. The mushrooms have led me where I need to go, which is tap me in more to the roots. It's tap me in more to the community. And it really does help order my steps. I'm not the person who has incense burning all day, but this is real.
Yeah, that idea of it being an ancient spiritual technology that reconnects people, especially when you're talking about cultures, whether it be indigenous Native American, whether it be African cultures that in the past several hundred years have had their identities written over, driven over in the books of history, to kind of re-embrace and realize that the struggle that we've seen in the modern 100 years is not really the identity. It's like get past that to like the beautiful, rich, powerful culture that's there. I'm fascinated. And people you mentioned, it works, who I'm a big fan of, I'm just fascinated with that idea. And again, it speaks to the idea that BIPOC communities have some of the most to gain from using this psychedelic technology, if you will. And there's nothing wrong with burning sage and carrying crystals in your pockets either. I think that all goes together. So there's tons for people to dive into there. I really encourage people to do their research. You've given some great resources, but I do want to make sure we cover the psilocybin cup. It's something I've been seeing all over social media. I think there are already some kind of little pieces of information I'm hearing coming out of your research that are already like changing my perspective on psilocybin mushrooms. So maybe talk about the inspiration for the psilocybin cup and then what that event is.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you again. Again, thank y'all for tuning in. I want to say this before we get to the end. You can buy a ticket to the programming for the psilocybin cup on my IG. It's Oakland Hyphae. Instagram, just click on the link to the bio and you can sign up for the talks. If the finances are a burden to you, just DM me and we'll make sure that you still have access. It's not going to be a problem. So having that said, the psilocybin cup, the inspiration behind that was, I guess, where I left off it with the initial story. I started going to Decriminalize Nature meetings all the time, getting as active as I could. And through Decriminalize Nature meetings, I met one of my, the current partner. His name is Ian Bollinger. I know he does some science work with SFPS too, but I met him. And I met a few other scientists in the space because I'm going to meetings asking, hey, who does science or who does testing? I need to understand this. I knew nothing. I'm not a scientist. But, I am very aggressive about trying to answer the questions that I want to answer. I ended up initially partnering with a physicist, and we started trying to use, I believe it was a gas chromatograph, but that wasn't giving us the results that we were looking for. So we settled in. I decided to go ahead and buy a liquid chromatograph, and it worked. At the time, we were trying to integrate some of her AI technology to the project. And I think that my partner saw daylight and saw a bunch of potential. And so it became a thing where they wanted to go at a pace that I didn't want to go at. So we parted ways. I took my equipment and took some scientists with me, and, we kept going. Finally, we perfected a method that we were comfortable with. We secured standards, we got lab space, and we started testing. So the first round of testing we did for free. I went around to the sessions here in Oakland and just bought, I buy eighth of this, buy eighth of that. And I would tell the people, I'm buying it, I'm going to test it. And at that time, everybody's like, yeah, okay, whatever. As long as you're spending money, I don't care. But then we ran it and we got the results. And some of the people who were at the top of the list, all of a sudden you go to the sessions and, they have their price high because the guy next to them, yeah, they have cheap mushrooms, but these people have proof of exactly what you're going to get when you purchase their mushrooms. So it's starting to affect the local economy. So we did that. We ran the test again. We did a second round, more people. This time I took samples from a lot of people online. The internet blew up. Everybody was excited about it. It was fun. People started talking. And in that round, we started deciding to take the test deeper than potency. We wanted to start answering questions. Okay, do caps have more potency or do stems have more potency? Because I'm tired of having these stupid conversations. Like, oh, yeah, I had one and it was hitting. What does that mean? What does hitting mean?
Right.
And people would die on their hill with no numbers, no real data to quantifiable data to back their position up. And so we ran that test and we concluded that the stems had more potency in them. The difference was negligible, but if anything, the stems had more potency in them than caps. And then that spawns a whole different conversation around theories. Like, why is that? So
right.
It's fun and it spawned conversation. And then after I put those tests out, my inbox exploded with people asking that I do these tests for money. I've been doing all this for free. I've made all the investments out of pocket just for the love of the science and understanding and having informed conversations. We sat down and we figured out my partners really wanted to go straight into business. I was not necessarily interested in going straight into business. If I go into business, I want to build something that I know will work. I don't want to have to build and scrape. And so we're trying to figure out how do we go about this and still keep it fun, but make it like at least we can get something back for the research, and so we talked about it, and we settled on, we can make it into a competition, a friendly competition. We can answer some questions, we can invoke some conversations, and we can do this. I was like, they do it in cannabis, why not do it here? Like, what's to stop us? What made it a problem before was, okay, well, how do you judge? Are you going to have one person eating 8 samples? Like, how does that work? Are you going to judge by looks? Like, how are you going to do it? And so we anchored the competition in the testing. There was something that made sense about anchoring the competition in the testing. And we formed a structure for it. We formed an intake structure, and we put the call out. And we took a leap of faith, putting yourself out there. The community could shit on you, any number of things could happen, and, it could not go right. But the community embraced it. The community supported it. The community asked for it, and then it sold out. We had a number that we were going to take. We sold out. So, I mean, it's been amazing. And since then, we've had literally some of the best cultivators that most people know sign up. Like I have a sample from Mycotech that is entered in. I have a sample from Willie Myco that's entered in. There's any number of people who we've watched their YouTube videos and learned some things from them have entered in. And so it's been really embraced, really supported. And then the other piece beyond the anchor, because the anchor is a testing, but as a community organizer, there's all this other space of psychedelic activists and plant medicine activists. And so it's like, how do I infuse my value system, the value system that I always scream and say people aren't getting it right?
Yeah.
I own this company. I can do whatever I want. We decided to elevate and center the conversation on BIPOC and queer communities and women. The spaces that you look in a lot of other festivals or whatever, they'll do this to make sure they check a box. But we did this to really elevate these voices and to marry these communities. So we have this mushroom community that's over here that more or less looks one way, but they're still really cool people. And then we have this plant medicine activist community over here. And I wanted culturally relevant programming for people to look like me. It's relevant for everybody, but it's the same as like when I walked into my first Decriminalize Nature meeting or my first SFPS meeting when I'm the only Black person there and I need to pick up tidbits from those spaces. I still found plenty of benefit, but I had to be comfortable being the only person in that space and finding value there. And so we just kind of flipped it around. It's a space that's very comfortable for me to be in, and it's very welcoming for everybody to be in. But we definitely centered. I think that 95% of our speakers are women or people of color. And the other paradigm shift that we tried to do was, a lot of the people call these people of color and these women, these queer folks to check a box. And then these people schedule out time. They give a lot of their intellectual information and they give credibility to this other company or organization. A lot of these organizations charge tickets for these talks and they don't pay these speakers anything. And so what we decided to do was we paid everybody an honorarium to, a lot of these people, if you watch the talks at the end of them, a lot of them just said, hey, I need to live. I need money. And so we put money into everybody's pockets. So we are charging for tickets for our talks, but the money goes right back out to the people who you see that you got something from. So we just are trying to shift paradigms here, have a good time, and give people some good information at the same time.
Well, and I love that idea. It speaks to the importance of having someone who is part, whether it be female, whether it be Black, whether it be Indigenous, having those people at the center, at the lead of different organizations in this space to make sure it is inclusive as possible. I think that's like the ultimate answer to making spaces inclusive is put the different communities, underserved communities, underrepresented communities in positions of leadership. And I've heard that before, don't just put the call out to have people come and contribute value, put them at that leadership position. And suddenly it'll be way more inclusive just by every little piece of perspective and everything else. It would be way more inclusive than it would have been if you had just tried to be inclusive and had like a European kind of hierarchical structure. That's really important to highlight. So the idea then is like this competition and the testing is kind of the anchor center thing going on with the psilocybin cup. And then it also ends up being a venue for speakers and all that for people to kind of hear more information.
Yeah. You mentioned William Padilla Brown. He's there. I consider him a genius. There's a science and plant medicine talk. And I guarantee you that talk is fire. William Padilla Brown's a genius. He starts talking about some stuff and all right, I'm done with my questions. You go.
Definitely, definitely. Well, and I am curious, just because we mentioned the testing, and I think that's something that sparks a lot of imaginations. It is like the big stat. Oh my God, there's more psilocybin in stems than caps. That made me kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? Like this is giving me new insights,
Yeah.
just like already.
Yeah.
So what does the testing look like when you're using the liquid chromatography? Without giving the whole overview, just like what are the general processes? Are you taking actual dried psilocybin mushrooms, grounding them up, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So depending upon the type of test we're working, it might change a little bit, but uh, the gist of it, the overarching gist is we take a fruit body, we homogenize that fruit body so that we can get as consistent results as possible throughout, cap and stem, homogenize it. We have solvents that we add to the fruit body and process it that way. And then we run the information through the chromatograph. Keep in mind, I'm not a scientist, but this is a layman's explanation of what happens. We compare what we get to a standard of the various compounds that we're looking for. And based upon peaks on the chromatograph, we're able to quantify parts per million of psilocybin or psilocin or baeocystin or norbaeocystin that's present in whatever sample that we submitted.
And so are you guys getting any insights? Maybe this is kind of down the road, but the importance of some of these other compounds within the mushroom. I know that's a big topic when you talk about the whole future of psilocybin, companies extracting just psilocybin or psilocin, putting that into something and then just doing that. Have you guys found any insights about relative importance of baeocystin or other compounds to the overall effect of the mushroom or potency? Or maybe, like I said, maybe that's down the road.
Between myself, our science advisory board, and our actual scientists, we have a bunch of inquisitive nerds at the table that have, I'm asking questions from a cultivation standpoint. They're asking questions from a science standpoint. We get a bunch of interesting questions to answer at the table. However, Oakland Hyphae we're in our infancy. We're just over a year old. And we're independent. So unlike a lot of these labs that, you get funded, you can come in and start with $300,000 worth of equipment. We literally have to piece it together and then, go earn more money, and piece it together and then go earn more money. So as things like the Cup become successful, and as things like the Oakland Psychedelic Conference become successful, we'll be able to push our research and answer more questions. So to answer your question directly, yes, it's on the horizon, but no, we have not really gotten into those avenues of research right now.
And is there other research like this going? Because I haven't heard of it, but is there other psilocybin research going on outside of, a strictly clinical or academic setting like what you guys are doing?
As far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, we're the only people in the country, if not the world, doing this. And we have an added value of having access to excellent scientists,
Right.
who understand the science and think like scientists and clinicians. But we also have the added value of having cultivators to help be able to run the test the right way and to ask questions that scientists might not be able to think of.
It's really fascinating work. I think anyone who starts to look at what you're doing on the page, some of the takeaways from the actual cup itself, you'll have a reaction like I did, like, oh my, we need more of this, especially as, this takes off in the cultural consciousness. We need more kind of community-based science and integration of people that have been doing this for the longest, even when it was prohibited, to kind of be the voices and perspectives, setting the framework of like, what are the standards by which we measure the psilocybin mushrooms, all that kind of thing. Aside from the cap and stem, were there any other things you didn't expect to find during testing, or any other things that would be little tidbits that we can sink our teeth into?
One of the interesting takeaways, if you look at maybe it's the first test, but one of the last two results that I put out, there's a Liberty cap that comes in kind of in the middle or toward the bottom of the list that tells me one of two things. Either it wasn't a Liberty cap, or it was an old Liberty cap that had its psilocybin and psilocin content degraded over time. So it brings up more questions. So for instance, as one of the tests that we're running personally, we still have some samples from our last round. And since we have results from our last round, we want to see 3-4 months later, is there degradation? And these are questions that people have, and people have theories, but no answers.
The amount of questions that you can posit and look at via testing just starts to get infinite. So I guess then what is the future for Oakland Hyphae? In terms of, I mean, you just talked about you guys are only a year old, you're positive for growth, but what does that look like? Because I know sometimes that path to growth can be fraught with big issues, leaps of faith. Do you bring on investment? I'm sure there are people in and around the mushroom community really interested in the work you're doing that want to get on board. What does that path forward look like for you guys? What is kind of your highest aspiration? What does that future development of Oakland Hyphae look like?
I love the fact that I'm independent. Again, I've worked with 2 international companies now, one Canadian, one domestic with ties to British royalty, and having the benefit of looking at what those deals look like, what they want versus what you get. If you don't have anything in your pocket, it looks like a good deal. But if you look at the upside of what the people at the top are going to get, it all of a sudden seems predatory and unfair. So I'm doing everything I can to stay independent. For Oakland Hyphae, the next 2 things that are on our radar is we're going to have another cup on 9/20 International Mushroom Day. We're going to do the announcement for the intake process on sometime in June. So take a look at that. And we're also talking with some community folks here in Oakland about hosting the first annual Oakland Psychedelic Conference. So we're looking to do that also in 9/20. Now I know for a fact the cup's going to happen. We'll see how the psychedelic conference comes around. I want to have it. People are in for it, but I control what happens with the cup. With a community event, you got to bring a bunch of folks together and make things happen in a short period of time. We shall see about that. In terms of business with Oakland Hyphae, as soon as the cup is over, we're going to roll directly into establishing Hyphae labs with me and my scientist Ian, and there we'll have testing open to the public as a service. As long as we're independent and as long as we have business coming in from the testing, we're saving that money so that we can upgrade our equipment and implement the next 2 phases of the testing in terms of Hyphae labs.
So you guys will be open then to the public, to anyone who's out there as a cultivator, where they can send samples into you guys. That's kind of the vision for the near future.
Yep. It'll be fun. Again, the people around me have asked for this to happen for a long time. And with things like this, I'm slow to draw just because I want to make sure that our protocols are tight first. But I'm comfortable with we've been doing this for a while now. We have a partnership set up with a pretty reputable, we're finalizing a partnership with a pretty reputable cannabis extraction lab to do second party validation. So we should have that offered as well, just so that we have another stamp of approval. But we want to do our best to kind of make this emerging landscape as inclusive and representative as possible. And quite frankly, I have a lot of faith in the mushroom community. I really do. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have the support from folks like yourselves and James at Hay Street Shroom Shop, Niggas in Nature, people like Inoculate the West, people like Willie Michael, Veterans Walk and Talk. And I know this isn't for this, but I just really feel like I need to shout the people out that have been helping.
Please, yeah.
We have sponsors. We have Twisted Tree Nursery that makes great dino substrate that's been helping us. So we're going to donate some of their stuff to the winners. We have Pacific Substrates, which is a newer substrate company based right here in East Oakland that supported us. And then we have a Jamaican wellness retreat called Diaspora Psychedelics that has donated a 3-day stay with medicine at their place in Jamaica. So, it's been community support. I really, really, really just appreciate everybody standing behind this and elevating it and supporting it. Y'all have enabled us to be able to do the next one. And hopefully here we believe in equity, but oftentimes I think that people think it's supposed to look like somebody doing something for us. And like, this is just, people are supporting, it's like, yeah, we're doing this and people are supporting and it feels different. It looks different. People are happy. It's not one person feeling like I'm doing this for you, lifting you up. Nah, we're here together and we're holding it up. And that feels really good. And I love the mushroom community for that.
Well, I think the mushroom community is unique in mimicking the organism that everybody loves. It's kind of this decentralized network of people that just all find out something is good and they rush to support it, and it kind of grows up organically. So I hope that continues to happen. Because you are someone who has experience both in the cannabis community and now the mushroom community, obviously in this realm of psychedelic mushrooms, you could very much find parallels in kind of the legislative battles and everything else. Do you see that there are lessons to be learned from the cannabis movement Do you see that the cannabis movement is kind of a model to follow or not follow? Or what is that relationship like? It might be totally different.
Overall, I'd say the cannabis industry is an industry to not mimic and not follow. However, a lot of people like Supernova Women with Nina Parks and Amber Center, they have paved the way to making really nice, solid equity programs here in Oakland. So I have some of those people talking on my panel, talking on my lessons learned from cannabis panel, just sharing their insights. And it's we have Keith Stevenson, who had the first licensed Black dispensary in the country, Nina Parks, who is a business owner. Her family's been impacted by the war on drugs, and she's pushed through, and she's an amazing activist. Amber Center, she was involved with Decriminalize in the beginning. She operates a cannabis company as well, as helps to shape the equity provisions. And then we actually have the cannabis commissioner for the city of Oakland, Cheney Turner, who also was speaking. And so the consensus that I heard from them was Oakland did a good job on equity, but everybody else is lacking. If we look anywhere for equity in terms of creating a space for legalization, I think that Oakland's equity model might work. But all in all, I am a huge fan of banning institutional money from coming into the space at all, even with legalization. Ban it. People say you can't, but you can. You can. Like you can. I'm looking at what's happening in Jamaica, where you have all this newfound tech money, independent millionaires coming in, really colonizing in a different